Welcome to Impossible Bodies.
Welcome back, everybody, or maybe you're here for the first time. This is our second event today, AI and music. AI and machine learning play an important role in the artworks we are presenting in our online virtual exhibition, and they are taking on ever more prominent roles in music creation. Tonight we will explore the creative possibilities of AI as a tool for music composition in this panel discussion led by Julia Kaganskiy. Welcome, Julia.
Thank you.
I would say go ahead.
All right, just diving straight in. Thank you so much for having me and our awesome panelists at Impossible Bodies. Thank you to everyone who is tuning in for this talk. We wanted to do a talk where artists who are working with AI right now can share some of their work, discuss some inspirations and thoughts about the creative possibilities and limitations of AI in music. Obviously, there's a lot of ground to cover, and we hope to discuss ideas about the future of AI in music, the future of music in general, as well as the implications of the use of these technologies more broadly speaking. There's so much to get into, and first and foremost, I want to have the panelists introduce themselves and say a few words about their work to give a bit of context for our conversation today. So what we're going to have is a really brief 5-minute intros from the panelists, kind of talking about their practice, and then we'll get into a Q&A that will be moderated by me. And then towards the end, we'll have about 10 or 15 minutes for Q&A from you guys, the audience. So please do type in your questions when you have them, and we will earmark them for the Q&A portion later on. Without further ado, I would love to introduce Claire Evans of Yacht to share a bit about her work. Claire, please take us away.
Hi, everyone. Okay, let me just share my screen. Here we go. Oh, gosh. Hi. So hello, my name is Claire, and I'm going to give you a lightning tour of the 7th album produced by my band. The album is called Chain Tripping, and it began with a relatively simple question about 4 years ago, which was, could we make a yacht record using AI? We did not know very much about AI going into this, but we knew that if the project was going to work for us, if it was going to be challenging in the right ways, we couldn't make like a generative or ambient or super experimental or like a noise record. We weren't trying to make, metal machine music. We wanted to make a pop record. We wanted to make a yacht record, something that would make sense as part of our catalog, something that we could kind of, perform and actually mean. So basically we wanted to make something that sounded like us and not like software. And this was complicated by the fact that we're not coders, so we didn't have a lot of control over the shape of our tools. And there seems to be kind of a real fetish in sort of the media and talking about artificial intelligence, and I'm sure we'll get into this in the discussion, for talking about machine learning solely in the context of automation and displacement. And this implies that it's somehow easier to make music using these tools than it would be in the usual way, which, at least in my experience, is not at all the case. It was far more labor intensive and tedious to make music using machine learning. I'm not going to get too deep into the weeds because we don't really have time, but we were really interested in using machine learning at a symbolic level. Everybody approaches this differently. For us, we were interested in using tools to generate notes and lyrics rather than sounds and vocal performances. So we were looking for a tool that would allow us to do that at a symbolic level, and that would give us a good amount of control over our inputs and our outputs, and would be relatively user-friendly for non-coders. For us, that tool was something called Music VAE. It's an open source tool. It's a latent space interpolation tool, which essentially allows you to plug in 2 different melodies, pairs of melodies, and then explore this highly psychedelic, high-dimensional mathematical space that exists in between those melodies, and then sort of sample from that space. So we were really interested in the idea of using machine learning to explore melodies and patterns hidden in between melodies and patterns from our own back catalog, from our own past. And that meant reinterpreting our past as data, which was kind of an interesting challenge. We had to manually annotate our entire back catalog, which is 17 years of music, into MIDI, into these little short MIDI snippets, and then run those pairs of melodies through this model repeatedly in order to generate new melodies and patterns, which we then, using our unique capacities as human beings, just listened to and tried to find what was interesting, said in this very unscientific way, this is interesting, this is good, this is useful, this is something we can use. And then we manually structured all those little pieces together into new songs, like creating a puzzle, and performed everything live. The lyrics came from a parallel process. We collaborated with a creative technologist and poet named Ross Goodwin, one of the giants of the field, in my opinion, who trained what's called a character recurrent neural network on a massive 20 megabyte corpus that's tens of thousands of pages of lyrics from bands that we loved, bands from our immediate communities, music that we grew up listening to, music that we loved, and music from our own back catalog. And after some tweaks and refinements, Ross sent us this massive sort of chunk of output, which we then printed onto a single sheet of dot matrix printer paper and brought with us into the studio. And this is kind of the text, the source text of the album. Every word on the album is in this text. And we loved the idea that although we were working with this highly technological process, the actual experience relationally of working with these tools was really analog and really tactile. And I think sort of high tech, lo-fi has always been the mantra of our band. We were way more inspired by older working techniques than anything particularly cutting edge. A lot of the writing process was inspired by Dadaist, cut up or aleatoric writing processes, which were popular, in the 1920s. According to the Dadaist poet Tristan Tzara, writing a Dadaist poem simply entails taking a newspaper, cutting up every single word in an article, putting it in a bag, shaking it up, dumping it onto a table, and then rearranging the words into a poem. And that same technique has been used by lots of writers and poets over the years. Of course, William Burroughs and his collaborator Byron Geisen, but also extensively by David Bowie, who used cut-ups for his entire career, both analog and computer assisted. And we love this approach because for us, the output of a machine learning model is not the end of a process. It's the beginning of a new process, or maybe a waypoint in between processes. Because the models that we use were really good at sort of jumbling up the world and generating new interesting source material, kind of tearing reality into fragments, if you will, and dumping it on the table. And our job as interpreters of this work was to reconstruct something meaningful from all those fragments, to give them order and purpose, and convincingly inhabit them until they became our own. So I think art is the work of making meaning, and no matter where you start, the process is still the same. That's what excites me a lot about the future, is this idea that even though new technological tools are arriving rapidly, we can still engage with older processes and techniques. It's not like when something new comes along, it just obliterates everything that's ever existed before. In fact, it just creates a more complex and interesting interrelationship between all these other techniques and approaches. And so, yeah, new tools like machine learning and AI don't need to obliterate older creative technologies. They can and do complement one another. I think that the new reactivates the old, and the old gives context and purpose to the new. That's my 5 minutes. So fast.
That was awesome. So much rich content and ideas in there that I'm excited to dig into with you in the discussion. Up next, we have Asa Horvitz.
Hello. Thank you, Impossible Bodies, for inviting, and to Julia for moderating. I'm super excited to be here because I know I'm going to learn a lot from everyone. I'm going to be a little bit of a nerd and just share my screen here and then share some questions that are really present for me at this moment. Let's see here. Beautiful. Everyone can see that? Great. Yeah, so just a very quick background. I'm a musician and composer. I'm based in Amsterdam. I really grew up in sort of jazz and experimental music. I worked with Anthony Braxton and Alvin Lucier. And then in the last 10 years, I've really moved into, I would say, the fields of visual and performing arts, working mostly in Europe, collaborating with artists like Scott Gibbons and Leo Castellucci. And in general, my work is centered in music, but is often entangled with other things like specific communities, contexts, and unconventional live performance formats. So I'm really working in the field of live performance, which is maybe like adjacent to the music field. Tonight I'm going to talk about a project called Ghost. This began as a collaboration with the engineer Serafina Tarrant, who's at the University of Edinburgh, and Alejandro Calcaño, who's at the Ethics and AI Research Institute, AI Now in New York, as well as the New York-based musicians Carmen Rothwell, Jackson Randall, and the longtime Zorn collaborator, Wayne Horvitz, and some other people. And our first idea was kind of to make a concert in which we asked a natural language processing AI questions about death, and we set its responses to music in real time. A bunch of our fathers had died in the last few years, and we thought it would be interesting to ask a machine learning system about death. And we presented versions of this in New York and in Amsterdam, and we recorded it, and we were basically working with polyphonic Georgian funeral songs, improvisation with like spoken and sung text, and a lot of modular synthesizers. You can listen to this stuff online on my website also. But now, over the last years, our partners have expanded a bunch, and we are now collaborating with people in Poland, in Germany, in the US, as well as in Hong Kong. And basically, the idea is that we now are going to make a specific musical intervention in each of these places, responding to how AI is being used by various agents in each of these locations. And we're sort of having conversations and slowly developing these, and we'll start with different premieres, let's say in 2022. And I also want to say that I think our approach has really changed from more or less using AI as a generator of material to using live performance as a space in which we can reflect on or stick our fingers in the process of machine learning, really from start to finish, and what it implies. And I'll just say a couple more things about that really quickly, and then we can move on. This is a question that we're sort of working on right now. Like, what is the structure of live music implied by machine learning systems? Like, what is the sonic dramaturgy of the algorithm? And this really comes from a desire to move past questions around, let's say, the future of music or general dystopia or utopia questions. There's a lot of reasons for this. There's a sort of smokescreen effect that can happen there. There's a really great article about that. It's covered in Trevor Paglen and Kate Crawford's writing on excavating.ai. And also for me personally, I'm, like for myself at the moment, not that interested in what I can do as a musician generatively with AI. Because I'm really trying to see this emerging thing better, to understand like, what is this actual thing? Because what I experienced in the process, and Claire, it's so funny that you mentioned the Tristan Tzara poem, because the last line of that is, you arrange all these random things, the poem will resemble you at the end. That's the last line. And that's what I keep experiencing, is that we would go through a while in the process, and then I would reach for things that I already knew, like a sound that was familiar, a distribution platform that was familiar, a system of basically aesthetics or relations to audiences that I already knew. And I'm trying to like displace that and see what's really going on here. And basically humans do the vast majority of labor in an AI system, as Claire was just describing, from organizing the data sets to working with the algorithm to deploying that into the world. This is already a fascinating structure with profound implications, like selecting pasts, who or what gets included, what doesn't, why, generating new futures through this sort of semi-transparent process. So yeah, we can ask a lot of questions about what this is. Is it a metaphor for consciousness, a theory of history? It's very close to many genre composition processes or improvisation in jazz, for example. But what I'm really interested in is like making a live event that includes the creation and selection of training data, processing and outcome in real time, perhaps stretched over several hours or maybe several days or weeks or months, because I really want to have a look at this thing, let's say, and be able to create a space where we can stick our fingers in it. And there's a lot of questions around that, like how to work with that structurally and all those kinds of things. But that's what I'm busy with right now, having kind of come from using AI as a generative model and now trying to use live performance as a space where we can really look at this thing from start to finish, and maybe make a space of reflection and kind of play with this technology that's programming so much of our lives. Because I think we don't really have a space where we can feel these systems. And I think music can really do that, can make a space where we can feel the kind of vibe or aesthetic that's we're all swimming in without whether we know it or not. So, okay, that's my 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Asa. I think, yeah, this drive to, these parallel drives to both sort of step outside of oneself through collaborating with this non-human entity, but also to use art, be it visual art or music, as a form of facilitating a deeper understanding of AI and its already existent forms, as well as its potential, is super, super important right now. Up next, we have CJ and Zack from Dadabots.
Thanks for having us, Julia.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, we've prepared a video to explain what we're all about, and we will show that to you now. Hey guys, I'm CJ from Dadabots. And I generate death metal with AI. This is a bot that generates death metal 24/7 and live streams it to YouTube. It's been generating for over a year. So we'll feed this neural network the discography of a band or one album. Then we have it generate, okay, what comes next? What comes next? What comes next? Forever. It's almost as if it's dreaming. So when fans reach out and they want us to make something for them, they'll say, here are my 4 favorite bands. Please just mix them and make something new. For example, we just launched Frank Sinatra singing Toxic by Britney Spears. I'm addicted to you. Girl, you know that you're toxic. And I love what you do. Don't you know that you're toxic? Our favorite thing so far has been working with artists. We've collaborated with dozens of artists. For example, the UK champion beatboxer Reaps one. We filmed a music video in the anechoic chamber at Bell Labs, where he battles his AI doppelganger. So if you're a band and you're looking to collaborate with this kind of tech, hit us up, dadabots.com. We're excited to work with you.
We're also interested in live music one day.
That was amazing. It's nice to also get a couple of audio clips demonstrating the range of sounds and genres that can be generated through this process. So last but not least, we have Vincent Korvan, aka Drug Culture.
Hey, how you guys doing? Thank you for having me. I'm just blown away by that last video. I was just like so excited by watching that death metal going on. I'm just gonna give you a little insight on who I am. I'm Vincent. Like I said, I started making music a long time ago. And I think my first actual record was this one, which I released on Bunker Records, which was like a cool thing to do in 1993. It's like a really overloaded acid. And at the same time, I was always playing in bands. So I was playing in a band called the Cvltvres. Look, this is me, the sturdy, angry-looking guy over here. We did pretty well, actually. We were signed to Roadrunner at one point. We toured the world. We played Japan. We did all that sort of stuff. And I kind of got fed up with the music industry and went back home and did 2 things. One of them was start a noise label and dive headfirst into something I was experimenting with which was making copies of records, vinyl records, with glue, with like wood glue, and then deteriorating them with needles and sandpaper. Doing that live with like 2 turntables. I did that for quite a bit, which was a lot of fun. And I started playing in a black metal band, which I still do. Not this one anymore, but I used to play in the Hill, which was quite acclaimed. Now I play in Blood, which is also, people don't seem to like it, but I don't really care. Besides that, I started making music as Drvg culture. And that's mostly like slowed down techno, acid, with a strong vocal thing in it. And I've been doing that for about 10, 11 years, I think. I've released a lot of records, but right now I'm just involved in the process of building something that would be Drvg culture without me. I'm calling it Euphoria Forever. I'm building modules inside Pure Data and Max to emulate my artistic choices. I believe that most of the choices I make, or we make as musicians, are like rehashed from our subconscious. It's all stuff that we've heard before. It's impossible to be original by that standard. And I was just thinking that it would be so great to have this program, Euphoria, to perform like an endless Drvg culture composition that would go on forever and ever and ever and ever. And I could just like listen to it and tune into it like a radio channel instead of just being the artist and making it. So that's what I'm working on right now. And the first experiments are really shitty. So it will probably going to take me some time to get this done. But when it's done, I think it will also be the end of my Drvg culture project. That thing can take over, and I can just go do something else. That's the end game. And that wasn't even 5 minutes, but that's the short version of who I am and what I do. So take it away.
Awesome, thank you. I think one of the things I want to start off with is something that I feel like I heard from each of you was, being drawn to AI and the process of working with this machine learning form of music making, be it emulation or another process of kind of discovering new sounds, new ways of composition, is a desire to extend outside of yourself, to either have this kind of way of creating music maybe posthumously forever into the future, or to get out of your own tendencies and comfort zones. And I'm curious about how this desire to sort of to use AI as an extension of your own music composition might be in tension with something that Claire mentioned, which is this kind of innately human ability to make meaning, which is something that we know, AI is probably not so good at, right? So yeah, I'm curious about the kind of the tensions that might exist between, on the one hand, this desire to get out of oneself, while on the other hand, the fact that the artist's job is to make meaning, and these autonomous processes are maybe not the best for that.
I think what you call meaning, I would rather call context. Mm-hmm. We don't, we think it's meaning, but it really is just something we've heard before and evoked a feeling with us at a certain point. I don't think it's impossible to have a machine do that at all. I think it's perfectly possible to have a machine do that. I think in the future machines will do it, and they will just on hashtags will be able to touch you emotionally as well with their compositions. So I don't think that's that far in the future at all.
I don't think that's impossible. I don't think those things have to be mutually exclusive either. You know, I think there's a lot of dialogue around these things where people seem to think that it has to be either or. We either have to have human-made art or machine-generated art, and there's no in between. I think there's an infinite gradation of in-betweens. I think some people will always be driven to human-made art because they're attracted to the context that is more associated with like geographic or subcultural scenes that those people embody and create together. At least back when we were allowed to have live performances, those things were really important. But people will also always be attracted to the cutting edge as well. And I think maybe even we can extend that question and wonder, you know, is there a world in which the future of music looks like making music for human beings making music for machines? I mean, who knows? These things are going to stay open-ended. I will say, though, that when we went into making our project, we had this idea that by sort of using machine learning to analyze our back catalog, we would come to understand something profound about ourselves, or that we would come to understand some underlying formula that defined our own work or our own approach. Like we would be able to get close enough to it to see what the formula was. And I think my experience of actually working with these tools made me realize that the formula is just the arbitrary decisions that the person makes in the moment when they're putting something together. I mean, that is the formula. What you do with your work and how you choose to put out in the world, that's all it is, you know, and it will always change and mutate as your perspective changes on your own tools and on the world around you.
Mhm.
I think that's very interesting, but I'm also very curious to hear, didn't you find patterns in there? Like, as I'm finding patterns in my musical decisions, like I've been analyzing the first like 50 key tracks of my this discography, which is like 160 releases. And I find that there are like key elements that keep popping up and are recurring, like the same thing as like a chorus is like, you know, 32 bars, and there's you know, stuff like that. It just keeps popping up. Did you find any of that?
Yes and no. I mean, I think we were playing a lot with temperature controls. So we were like, you know, a lot of the stuff that we were generating was really off the rails, and we were just looking for little moments that were interesting. And those were a little bit less, you know, had lower fidelity in terms of being like the source material. I think the patterns we did find were, and I hate to just like be the kind of like human being purist in the room, but the patterns that we did discover were like the embodied patterns of our own experience. Like when we tried to actually physically play these melodies that were generated by this machine learning model, it was really hard because they were generated by a system that has no relationship to the human body whatsoever. It's not thinking about whether this melody is going to be tricky to play on the bass or awkward to play on the drums because it involves a fill or a pattern that just doesn't make any intuitive sense and doesn't have any connection to, you know, a history of play. So we found ourselves often trying to just like record something that was seemingly really simple sounding, but because it was so weird, it was like brain-breakingly difficult to physically play. And that made us realize what our own patterns of play were in our bodies, like where our assumptions lied and how much of what we do is based on what feels good and our own experiences just jamming or just listening to things that we like and trying to mimic them. So there were patterns there, but they were inside us all along.
That's super interesting. And how quaint to use live instruments. No, I'm kidding.
I know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Zack and CJ, how do you find that there are like recurring? Sorry, I'm just. Do you find that there are recurring patterns when you analyze stuff? Or does the machine find the patterns?
Yeah, we didn't really use our own music like Claire was able to do. We are often using the music that we've listened to over and over and over again, obsessively until we're tired of it, and we're like, we just want more because this was such a great album. And we usually like branch off from there, and we find that these patterns, the things that the neural net does on its own, are sometimes generic and boring. We often look for like the things that are rarely happening, the patterns and the output that are just very uncommon. And we've even made tools to search the whole output for a hunting and gathering to find like, this is very rare. How could I find more pieces like this and avoid this more common motive that we're seeing constantly? So we think about it a lot of times as like searching for rarity.
I can jump in there a little bit and say something about like this question of recursivity and contingency, like these random bits or these things that you don't expect. And I think that has been really true. Like our process started from the engineer we work with was trying to develop a natural language processing algorithm for the Defense Department. And then they started breaking down. And the weird things this thing would say that was supposed to write like a pro-American Facebook post were super, super fascinating. And the other thing I think that's important there is just the question about meaning making and chance operations, because I think that there's a whole thing going on here with like AI is that, you know, it does have these parallels with certain chance systems, and the whole process set up around those things, like the I Ching or, you know, Tarot or the Zara poem. There's always this question about the way it's framed, you then generate meaning onto it in different, you know, in different ways. So when I think about this thing as having been generated by a certain kind of intelligence or from a certain kind of training data set or whatever, I'm going to make a whole different kind of meaning from the things that come out of it. And I think that these distorted artifacts, these things that aren't common, often can produce a very particular, very beautiful sense of kind of meaning being shifted or pushed into a place that I didn't know. You know, it's like a koan or something. It's like, whoa, this is pulling me into another universe. Yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing I find most compelling about working, especially with text generating models, where you get these turns of phrase that are so unexpected and so much outside, just not even so far outside of what you would think to do, but like 2 steps to the right of a place that you would end up normally, you know, just far enough beyond the meanings of sense or meaning, you know, that you find yourself having to kind of dislocate yourself to encompass it and bring it into your own discourse. I think there's so much of meaning, and this is something I think I also discovered in the process of making this record, is that so much of meaning exists between, you know, what we say and how we say it. And the same thing is true with music. I mean, what is on the page or what is in the MIDI track and how you actually perform and interpret that, and the choices that you make about production, arrangement, style, the room you recorded in. I mean, there's so many choices, these micro choices that just add up and ultimately create something that's really distinctive, even if you're working from a system that's, you know, generating something kind of formulaic or whatever. I think a lot of it is about performance, and we're, I think, fortunate as musicians that performance is a big part of what we do, I hope. And so we have a lot of opportunities to interpret and bring meaning just through the visceral experience of embodying it and performing it to other people. I mean, before COVID, we toured this record for 2 months, and the experience of singing generated lyrics to an audience and seeing the audience respond to it emotionally is surreal, because they're projecting meaning onto these words in the same way that I was in the studio trying to make sense of them. You know, we're all collectively trying to understand what these songs mean together, which is a new way of interfacing with fans and interfacing with an audience. Is we're all kind of on this collective meaning making journey.
Yeah, I want to actually dig into the performance element a little bit, because we typically discuss AI from the perspective of its ability to aid the composition process, the writing process. And it was interesting, Asa, to hear you talk about really digging into AI as a tool for live performance, and through that process really kind of exposing the material structure of the technology in interesting ways that can maybe help us understand it and feel it a bit more. So I'm curious about ways that AI might become a performer alongside the musicians, but also, you know, the comments that Claire has been making about the difficulty in translating music that has been written by AI into live performance.
Yeah, but one of the motivations behind us creating generative live streams is that take a record like, for me, Dillinger Escape Plan's Calculating Infinity, which is hardcore with expertly composed surprise, just surprise at its maximum. However, after listening to it 100 times, I memorized the whole thing, and then all the surprise is gone. It almost drains some magic about it that it used to have. However, with the generative process, it's always surprising. And so when we tune in like a radio show, like a radio station, like Vincent was saying, we can always be surprised.
Yeah, for me as well. I'm not gonna play live with this music. I'm a producer. The studio is where I make my music, where I make my tracks, and I'll just leave it all up to the new and improved drug culture, which can go on forever, and I can just tune in if I want. You know, just like changing a radio station. I think that's that will be happening more and more in the future, where you'll see artists or maybe clusters of artists or collectives just generating, generate their own style of stuff that will just go on forever. And I think it's really interesting, and I don't really see a room for me as a DJ performer to take that stuff and then perform it live again or something like that. I have no interest in it. Of course, I don't play an instrument on stage.
Maybe like expand. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
I can maybe expand a little bit on something. Can you okay?
Is everybody still there?
Yeah, there's a bit of lag, but we can hear you. Can you hear us, Asa?
I think we lost him.
Claire, did you want to jump in while we wait for Asa to reconnect?
Well, I was just going to ask, like, once the virtual drug.
Hello.
Oh, she's back.
Hey, Asa.
Sorry,
Great sound.
I don't know what
That's
happened.
Awesome sound.
I blame I think we went into a lockdown. I think that's what happened. Maybe I can just briefly expand a little bit on that. And sorry if someone else was talking when I came in and out. Yeah, for me, there's two things. One is that I think the structure of the AI system can tell us really a lot about a lot of things. How we think, how these systems are going to affect us for a long time, how they are affecting us already, all those things. And I think live performance can be a really beautiful space to expose that. So for example, I would like, let's say we're going to do this thing in Poland. Maybe the data set, we ask people to, let's say we want to work on death again. And so we create a space in a festival for 3 weeks where people can bring records or words on this theme, and we will put it into our data set. And then, we also expose the process as part of a performance, like we showed, the process of generating outputs and sorting the outputs. And then we also would then show, let's say, the sonic outputs from this. And then we also might do something kind of along the lines of what Claire was sharing, which is like, we take the text and we set it to music live. Or we take the text and we write compositions about it, and then we perform that. This just came from a lot of experimentation and feeling like the results were super interesting. And we did write this really beautiful, weird music from these words, or we did get really interesting sort of sonic artifacts happening. But that AI systems are so enmeshed in all these other things. And I think that like teasing that out and starting to play with all those other things is really, really, really rich. And there's like a whole universe there that we can also read against the kind of political deployment of AI, because I think that we need spaces where these technologies are exposed and where we can play with them, and not just conceptual essays where we're like learning about how we're all fucked and living in an AI utopia already. I mean, dystopia already. But yeah, I think it's good to have a place where we can stick our fingers in it and play a little bit. And I also think it's just really beautiful because I think there's so much emotional resonance around the question of choosing a data set. I think there's emotional resonance around watching this process happen. I think there's emotional resonance around watching the output happen also. When I first started, I didn't want to do any of that. I just wanted the results. And we insisted on this. And then after about a year, it was like, okay, actually there's something there. And some of our friends who were telling us that from the beginning were really right. That's all.
Not to dwell on this too much, but I do want to kind of get at the heart of this question, which is that, one of the things that's most exciting about working with AI is that it's a wide open field. There's no standards, there's no clear-cut path. It requires a lot of experimentation. And from hearing each of you talk, it's pretty clear that you have a very different approach and a kind of different philosophy or almost like research agenda as you work with AI to make music. So I think I'm just curious about, if you were to define what yours is, like what is that research question for you or that drive for you, what would it be? And very briefly, like what is it and what informed that particular approach for you? Dadabots, do you want to start?
Sure. I think that there's two approaches for us. One, we want to make extreme music. And I think this is very similar to Asa and Vincent. We're coming from a place of just, loving extreme metal, experimental hip hop like Death Grips, free jazz like Braxton and Zorn, and conceptual art music like Lucier and Cage, and just pushing that into the realm of high tech. And doing it with a touch of comedy, mischief, and provocation, as is the way in hackathon culture. And I think that the other half of it is that we engage the research community and bring the cutting edge to artists. And we're not the only groups that do this. Magenta also has worked with bands like Yacht and the Flaming Lips. However, Magenta's agenda is mostly do the research and only a little bit of work with the artists, whereas we are mostly interested in engaging the artist community. And I think Zack has some ideas about why this is good. Zack?
Yeah, okay, so engaging the artist community. Well, I think the big thing is that we really want to make sure artists are getting a look at all these algorithms that we're immersed in. This was kind of mentioned earlier, that like these things are running our lives ultimately, like neural networks, right? And recommendations and all these things. We need to have a diverse set of people looking at. That's really why we need to have not just engineers, not just scientists, but also poets and artists and visual designers. It's really important that in this like brief period before it really gets to be the thing that we imagine, it's all music will have some aspect of this in the future, that like everybody gets a look at the fairness and if it's a cool thing and design how it works with humans.
Yeah, I mean, just to jump off that, I think that it's really important for artists to be involved in this process as well. And that was kind of our goal, really. I mean, it's pretty self-serving, but essentially we wanted to understand machine learning. And the only way that we know how to learn about something so complex is just to try and live with it and push it around and adapt it and ultimately kind of ingest it through the process of art making. So, I mean, there's a question of stakes too. I mean, putting our name on a project involving AI meant that there were real stakes in terms of us coming to understand this technology better. If we're going to go out there in the world and distribute something that we made using a tool like this, then we better actually know what we're doing. And so it wasn't something that we could just brush off. And I mean, I'm not a coder, so I can't necessarily learn what's happening under the hood. I mean, as much as anybody can with black box systems, but I know that I can develop a kind of experiential relation to these tools. I can put something in, see what comes out, try to understand what happened in between, adapt my process based on what I learned, put new things in, keep going, which I guess is kind of not that much different than actually the work of engineering these tools. But yeah, learning through doing, and then hopefully communicating, with this final project and the opportunities that you have around a project like a record to talk to people and to share with people, hopefully communicating and demystifying a little bit what this technology is and how it works, and making it feel a little bit more approachable and a little bit more comprehensible to people who are coming at it from, not the perspective of being in the tech industry or being engineers. I think artists have a responsibility as communicators too, to use what they know and transmit that to their audiences and create like a, low stakes conversation zone around new subjects and integrating those subjects into our lives.
Yeah, I just gonna jump in right there. That is exactly what I mean with the gentrification of AI. By sending in the artists first, it's like every zone in our city is artists going in first, setting up shops, setting up like workshops, places to work, very cheap rent, everything's fun, and then their bulldozers come and they put up like high stories, high risers, and the big condos that can't afford anymore. That's kind of the feeling I get from the way that we are working right now. I don't know. The future is like it's not a negative thing per se. It's not a positive thing. It's a thing, and I think it's up to us to see how this develops in the future, and how we can steer it away a little bit from what I expect to be like big companies jumping in at some point and doing like stuff with it that none of us can foresee right now or can expect right now, but it will be not fun for us probably in some way. So I don't want to be like the dystopian guy, but I think I feel it's something I want to know more about. I want to learn. I want to understand. And I hope as many people as possible, hope and learn and understand how this works. Just like Claire said, I think that's really a good thing, that non-tech people can understand what it is and what we're really talking about at this point.
Just to jump on the point about access, I think what Zack said and what's been echoed across the board is really, really important, because we are already living in an AI dystopia, but there is this narrow window where these tools are, let's say, accessible and can be somewhat transparent. And I think, a lot of people who are working with these are like nerdy white males interested in extreme music, which, hey, I can't hate myself here, but it's really important that these tools end up in the hands of many, many people who are not that, who
Absolutely.
are in other places on the planet, who are doing other things, and who are just coming from, in our own cities, from very different backgrounds, because the kind of, the stories that are out there about AI and the thing that most people think is AI is so mystified, and just anything we can do to demystify it and to bring these systems down to earth is crucially important, and sharing tools and technologies. And so that's part of why I do what I do, is because I think there has to be this educational component, just sharing this information. Yeah.
Maybe this is a simplistic analogy to a simpler time, but I often think about the introduction of synthesizers and drum machines in this context, because initially these were tools that were ostensibly designed to replace string sections and drummers or whatever for the purposes of creating inexpensive recordings or inexpensive demo recordings. And a lot of musicians were seriously opposed to that. I think the British Musicians Union tried to ban synthesizers in the 80s. But ultimately what happened, which is what always happens, which is artists sort of took a beat, started playing around with these tools, and then used them to create, techno and hip hop and new wave and post-punk and house music and basically everything interesting that happened musically in the 20th century. So this is a pattern that happens again and again. I think it's one of the central roles of artists, this kind of diffusion of threat, technologies arrive that sort of claim to simplify a process while implicitly displacing or automating creative workers, until some creative workers stop that from happening by making the technology central to a new form of creative work that only they can do. So it's sort of like diffusing a bomb by turning it into an engine or something. So I definitely see the writing on the wall when it comes to things like the gentrification of AI and some of the scarier stakes. But I also have a lot of faith that artists will just continue to do what they always do, which is, find ways to make themselves essential and to kind of neutralize some of the impending threats.
On that note, I would like to get a little bit more specific around tools. We're talking a lot about access and giving people the tools to make music with AI. And so, if you were starting out today, what would you recommend people use? And what kind of pitfalls would you try and warn them to steer clear of that maybe you've had to learn the hard way?
Well, these days, Google Colab exists. It's free GPU that anyone can have access to for 12 hours at a time. You can train a net, look at collabs like DDSP, Melgan, Open Unmix, and just have fun crafting your data set and see how the output comes out. You don't even need to know coding. You just have to execute a few lines of code, change a few file names, and you're good to go. That's how to start.
Good advice.
What if that's too scary, though? I feel like that's too scary for some people.
It's too scary
notebook.
For me.
Yeah.
I found working with collab notebooks infuriating, but ultimately, if you click around long enough, you can figure it out. That's my tool. My hack for all software is just keep clicking until you find your way out. But I also think there's lots of new tools, and the technology is evolving so quickly that it's almost impossible to keep track at this point. I mean, one of the key tools that we used on our record, we used as a collab notebook, which was a nightmare. And then by the time our record came out, it was a live plugin. So things are evolving rapidly, and there's definitely more and more accessible tools. If you're interested in visual art and text, I highly recommend the platform Runway, which is kind of like a Photoshop for AI that allows you to play around with a lot of models without having to know anything about what's happening underneath, which I'm sure is the trend. I mean, now there's Photoshop has neural filters and stuff. So that's going to be something that we see more and more of.
I would also say just make friends with teenagers, because no, really, because 14-year-olds can figure out in 10 minutes what it took me 6 weeks to figure out in Python. And I think, start collaborate, and also just start collaborations with engineers, because engineers really often want to work with artists, and also these two groups of people need to be talking to each other, because I think I've been to so many things in the last couple of years where, the artists are all saying bad things about the engineers are not there, or vice versa. And I think, that needs to happen more.
I totally agree. I think there's something really exciting about this domain in that it sort of forces collaboration, because I don't know that many people who have like the high level brain that allows you to work with the code side of this and who are art geniuses at the same time. You kind of need to find people that are excellent at what they do so that you can complement your own skill set and build something bigger than the sum of its parts. And sometimes that means, seeking out engineers or research scientists or people that you think are outside of your, creative realm. Like, they're actually so excited to talk to you and definitely want to help, in my experience anyway.
I think I totally agree. You just find people that are smarter than you and have them help you. That's always a smart idea if you're a president or an artist. And the other thing I think is, don't be afraid to make mistakes. I just screwing around with code. I started with some algorithm stuff, and I just it was terrible, really terrible. But it doesn't matter. Every time you try, you learn something new. You get some new knowledge, and then at some point you'll be happy with the output that it creates. And if you can't realize what you have in your mind, then I think I really suggest that you find people that want to help you or have knowledge on the subject. I was very happy to work with Stephen McAvoy of the Danish Fine Art Institute, who showed me a lot of stuff that I really liked, and he also sent me patches and stuff like that. So most people are really generous and helpful. So just ask.
But also, Dadabots are both. Which I think is why they're able to do what they do so well and in such a cool way. So
yeah.
Hackathons are the place to go where engineers and artists meet and collaborate, and they work on a project for a weekend. I think between me and Zack, we've done almost 100 hackathons, maybe. Quite a bit. And it's actually where we learned Python. It's where we learned machine learning. We were lucky enough to sit down next to PhD students, grad students, when we were just undergrads. And they were teaching us, how to use Jupyter notebooks, how like signal processing works. Extremely helpful if you're a musician or a coder.
Make friends is the best way.
I think this technology this moment requires just a lot of cross-disciplinary collaboration in general, which is only a good thing. We have a question from the audience, which is how mainstream do the panelists think AI will have become in, say, 10 years?
Somebody else wants to go first?
I think that there'll be many levels of its use. There will be memes that are very easy to make. It's just jokes between friends. It's not much more than saying like, hey, here's the punchline, and like use it generate some stuff based on this stuff that we like, our inside favorite bands. That is a very accessible level. I'm sure platforms like TikTok and things like this will have all kinds of generative tools. But that's just kind of for like fun and communication. At like the more music level, I think live music's going to start to open up, and better interactions with fans are going to be a new thing in hybrid online and physical events. We'll find ways to connect people to local communities globally. And as far as the whole like commercialization of like, do we just maximize making money with algorithms? I think that kind of thing is really up to the audience. And, if we reject that, it's going to be less in style. We have that now. We have mega teams of, like musicians behind mainstream artists that are working in ways that we think are kind of formulaic. A lot of people say like, oh, that's just a pattern in pop. I could do that. And I think that, introducing AI doesn't change too much about that. And we're all just going to have to decide where entertainment, where jokes and memes, and where like the music and art all kind of like divides.
Yeah, agreed. I think it'll stop being something precious and cute that we talk about at art and tech festivals, and it'll just become something that's integrated into creative production at every level in every discipline. And it will not be something that's unique. It'll be, it'll be no different than a filter or, a processing tool in music.
I just can't wait to hear the AIs emulate like pop stars and have Spotify be flooded with AI generated content, which will sound like an original artist, but you'll never know the difference. Just it will be slightly different, and they'll just keep all the revenue because it's their own AI. And on the other hand, I don't know. It's like the same. Do you know this CD series that was like popular like 20 years ago? Synthesizer Greatest. You had like synthesizer versions of like pop hits. It was like, does anybody know this?
Like hooked on, but like switched on Bach.
Yeah. But worse. Like synthesizer versions of like ELO and stuff like that. And I think it will be something like that in the near future, and in the far future it will be perfected. Whereas where the AI will generate a show, a movie, a series for you, specific to catered to your specific mood at that point. But it'll take some time probably before it's perfected. But on the other hand, in games, the generative aspect is becoming so good and so good looking and so hard to distinguish from reality that it will probably, I don't know how long it will take, but my guess will be between 10 and 15 years till most of media will be AI generated.
We are not already living in a simulation. We will in 10 to 15 years.
It's not a simulation. It's entertainment. It's only entertainment. So there will always be people that will want something else, that will want the real thing, that will want to meaningful artist to make a song that's that speaks to them. But there will also be people listening to a radio and they don't really care if it's like AC/DC or AI AC/DC. They'll just gobble it up because it's like background music for them. I think that's the distinguishing thing that we'll be seeing in the future at some point.
I mean, that opens up a lot of questions for me about, what we see as the future of music and entertainment, which I kind of want to get into, but I also want to get into this question of, I think one of the challenges for artists who are working with new technology is that ultimately these tools are commercial products. Or will become commercialized. So like AI is still kind of in this basic research phase where there are a lot of open source tools, but more and more it's kind of becoming the proprietary domain of these big tech companies like Google, IBM, Tencent, Spotify, right? And I feel like a lot of the work that is done by open source contributors and by artists is this kind of creative R&D that ultimately gets folded into or just completely overpowered by the product version of what is ultimately sold back to people. So I'm always curious about how artists negotiate this kind of double-edged sword of working with emerging technology.
Well, I don't think it's much different than dealing with gatekeepers in every other domain of creative practice. It's not that much different than like major labels or the media or institutions or museums or even like creative tools like Photoshop or whatever. I mean, the things that we use to make our work and the ways that we have to are forced by the platform economy that we live in to distribute our work means that we're always making these kind of uneasy negotiations with a variety of gatekeepers who may not have our best interests at heart. I think the best you can do is try to make something that you can feel proud of and you feel is real, despite in the midst of all of this. And then hopefully that little signal carries. I mean, what else can we do?
Yeah. That's a fairly optimistic way of looking at things, which I appreciate. I think we are out of time. I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in and add a final note, or if our hosts want to come back and say some parting words.
Let's end this on a high. Let's go.
Thank you guys.
Here I am again. Thanks so much, guys, for this really inspiring conversation. I think I will look it back on our YouTube channel because there were some very interesting thoughts there. So thanks again, and I hope I will see the audience back tomorrow. We have live events every day until Sunday. And also we have our music program still going on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. So make sure you will tune in again. And well, thanks and have a lovely evening.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thanks
you.
for having me.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Thank you. It was fun. It's too short, but it was fun.